really excited to have the opportunity to speak with the three of you, obviously cross-cutting different sectors. Michael, we met around the corner from our houses in Brooklyn recently to talk about your work in government. You reflected today, really opening my eyes to thinking about how behavior is not just the individual, but upstream, and like you said today, that lens through which you look at things. Rocky, we talk on Tuesday nights. For me, your Wednesday mornings, weekly. It's really exciting for the last year and a half. And your work scaling across thousands of communities, hundreds of leaders, but also across RARE, and thinking about the nonprofit model. And then Matt, just incredibly inspired by your clear communication that actually companies sell behavior more than they sell products. So you know the corporate side. So we have all three sectors here represented in our expertise, and really interested in your experience and how we bring this back to where we come from. So Michael, I'm going to start with you. In terms of growing this capacity in your organization, we have everything from students to academics, NGOs, companies here. What do? Do you wing it? Do you bring it in and hire in-house? Or do you hire consulting firms? What's the best way to get started if you're just beginning this process at your organization?
It depends. Here are three things to think about, though. One, expectation setting. This stuff isn't instant. You need a bit of luck as well, frankly. But it doesn't happen overnight. And what you don't want is set the expectations really high, and in 8 months' time, people going, that behavioral thing, what happened to it? It's not doing anything. So it varies in your organization. Can you set up a team under the radar that doesn't set those expectations too high? Can you get some resource in from outside surreptitiously? That's one thing. Second thing, expectations, but also expectations. Yeah, then the second thing.
As I said, I'm facilitating the final panel of the day.
Yes, very sorry about that. Let's just go with expectations for now. Okay, so quickly, timing. So is it a moment of opportunity? So if you've got someone who will make an investment one-off, and then that's it, then you've got to go for it, I would say. Or is it going to be a longer-term investment? That's the other thing I'd think about.
Any thoughts on that question before we go on to the next one in terms of building and hiring in-house versus building capacity in outside, or just going it alone? Following up.
Like I said earlier, I think in our case, we really want to try and share that capacity across all the partners that we're working with. Everybody has to have a little bit of ability to do it, and then you bring in extra help when needed.
Yeah, so Rocky, maybe I just follow up there for you. You mentioned the situation in your talk. You have integrated behavioral science across Fish Forever, but then you're in this one specific challenge where you brought in the B Center, which is our in-house capacity. As you think about growing, or having grown this within RARE and advise others and other organizations, how do you think about that, the integration of behavioral science across your team?
I think like I said, I think everybody needs kind of like a minimum level of capacity that we try to help not just our staff, but also implementing partners build. I think one of the dramatic things we've seen over time is when we bring in, let's say, a mayor or a government staffer to actually do an empathy session and just kind of like really start to think differently about how people behave and have that as part of their kind of like basic arsenal. And then when the opportunity presents itself, they're much more able to then say, okay, we can work on this.
Does your team, do they think of themselves as behavioral specialists? Or are they turning to that when they need it? Is it a switch they're turning off and on?
I think, yeah, it's more that. Increasingly, we are seeing, let's say, marine scientists kind of say, but I also know behavior science, right? And therefore, I need to think about that as I think about fisheries management rules and regulations and what that means from a behavioral perspective.
And Matt and Michael as well, the same question in terms of experience in private sector and then government, in terms of the capacity and having it in a centralized unit you're turning to versus bleeding across either the company or government. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm with Michael in the sort of it depends. I mean, both he and I have been fairly vocal advocates of sort of a more behaviorally informed organization. Yeah. I think there are times, it's like owning a house. Sometimes I just need a professional, I don't touch the electricity in my house. That's for an electrician. There are lots of handyman things I will try myself where the stakes are low and I can afford to learn and I can afford to go through that process and fail forward and get better at it. There are times when I can't. And I think that applies in behavioral science. There are moments where you've got one chance, you have to make it work. Go get the behavioral insights team to help you nail that one moment. But there are other moments that core capacity has to follow along behind because you need to get to a place where, this is something everyone can do. And again, that's, I think, why I hit so hard on the all of us are behavioral scientists. We all can be more behavioral in nature. Even if you're on the impact team, even if your job is just to tell me what behaviors you want, you can help me by telling me, making accurate wishes, telling me when you rub that lamp what you want out so that I can make that happen.
That's powerful. What about in government from your perspective?
I think whether you've got a centralized team or a set of individual experts distributed around the organization, the key is how do you graft it in? Because either way will not work if they're kind of just spinning the wheels, not integrated into the prompts, the processes that happen every day in that organization. That, for me, is the key factor.
Absolutely, great deal. Matt, just one more question for you and see what others think as well. I think you've gotten to this with everyone being a behavioral scientist, but on the technical capacity, I mean, it feels like certainly of an environment, and I know you're both thinking beyond environment, we're in the early stage of this adoption as a sector, so we don't have thousands of PhDs in behavioral science to turn to. So when I'm hiring our next behavioral scientist, or I left here and I've got the funding to do it, what do I need to look for in capacity? What can I draw from?
Well, it certainly isn't a PhD, right? The first PhD was awarded in the US, at least, in the late 1800s. So unless you think science magically started in the late 1800s, clearly non-PhD people can do science, right? And I think that that's important for all of us to remember. I also think, we've moved away from this idea of a singular behavioral scientist, right? I talk about 5 roles, right? The strategist, the quantitative researcher, the qualitative researcher, the designer, and then the evaluation manager. And it doesn't really matter if you use those 5 or you slim it down to 3 or you come up with some other 5. The key is that process bit, right? The mechanization of behavioral science, is what allows us to do things at throughput because frankly, leaders won't wait, right? If you're like, well, I'm gonna come back with a solution 12 months from now, they'll just make a decision, right? You have to be able to operate at speed and scale. And that requires commodification. It requires the ability for you to say, okay, I'm going to get this behavioral statement. I'm going to do the quant. She's going to do the qual. You're going to do the evaluation. And we're going to move it along at a pace that allows us to sort of move at scale.
Either Rocky or Michael, on the expertise side of things, do you have certain things you're looking for, problems to solve, or skill sets you need bringing in?
No, I think I'm with you fully on that. And I think that's what we've been trying to do across the program. There's really things that we make sure people know how to do at its most basic. There are things that we bring in a central person to kind of help pull together. And then there are things that we bring in the big guns for when we really don't know what to do next.
Yeah, across the board.
We tend to talk about behavioral science if it's things that you know, and we tend to neglect the personal persuasiveness side of it because fundamentally, you've got to have someone in your organization in your team who can communicate what you're doing and why in a language that matters to that broader organization.
Yeah. One of the things we talk about sometimes, T-shaped people. So, broad horizontal understanding, right? You need to know what a correlation is. Everybody needs to understand at some basic level what is correlation. Yeah. You don't need to be, not everybody's doing multiple hierarchical regression, right? But there are some people who are. We need that T-shape. And I love Michael's point because you have to be able to communicate at those 2 levels. We used to do this thing on my team called tea time. So on Fridays, we would all get together for lunch, and someone would present an area of deep expertise, but a level the rest of us could understand, right? So I had a great data scientist give a talk about correlation. He was like, what do you think the correlation between gender and height is, right? And then we talked about it. He would show, hey, 0.7 is not, it's about as strong as it gets, Then they would go off and talk in their legs. They'd have conversations that I wouldn't even understand because they're often that individual piece. We need to allow people, to Michael's point, to communicate both at deep levels of expertise with similar experts, right? The conversation we have with each other is not necessarily the conversation we're having with you, and that's okay, right? But it doesn't mean that we can't talk to each other.
No, it helps a lot. Rocky.
I'd like to add an extra dimension to that. I think when you try and think about taking that down to communities and the kind of folks we work with, you can even imagine putting some of that in the hands of experts in the community. So if you explain, for example, the principle of social influence and what that means, but then you've actually got this great community organizer that actually says, I know exactly what that means in my community where I can get the priest to say something in church, right? That's their piece, right? And I think we all play in that broad space.
I appreciate it. What have you experienced, to be the final one here before we close out, but what do you all experience of the barriers of entering a new area? Either new company, new organization, new government, I don't know how many governments you work with, Michael, and not as exposed to this field, or even new sector. What are those common barriers to adoption of behavioral approaches, and some ways you think about getting over them to, say, skeptics who are like, really? Can't I just pass a law, run finance, et cetera?
I think one of the biggest issues is actually the field. We sweep the difficulties under the carpet when we talk about, we give these stories of things we did. The book Nudge, for example, people read it and think, oh, well, there's an easy solution. And so you come in thinking, oh, okay, all we have to do is this one weird trick. That is not the message we're giving. It's a process which can develop, and give outcomes. But I think the expectation setting that you can just take something off the shelf and implement it and it will work straight away is one we have to work against. It can have results, but it's not that simple. And that's, I think, a narrative we've been trying to develop over the last 15 years.
Yeah, really challenging, given that many people can understand that nudge concept, and it gets them into the conversation, but how do you take them to the bigger conversation? Okay, any thoughts as you try to expand this work, and any barriers? I know there's so few barriers to your work.
Easy, boss.
Oh,
no, I think it's the idea of being able to do this on an ongoing basis is something that stops people. And sometimes I think what's necessary is just there's got to be somebody constantly asking the questions of, wait, did we remember to think about this side of, the human side of things? Because then you get back to the work of the policymakers and things like that, then they forget again. So somebody has to keep asking, I think.
Yeah, the sustainability, durability of the work is so critical. How about yourself, Matt?
But to your point, it does become habit at some point,
yeah.
right? Like, and it's building that muscle memory as an organization. I think one of the things that comes up all the time in my work is scientists go through this process by which they try and simplify things. And they look at these things and they're like, this is simple. Column B, how simple could this possibly, behavior change wheel, how simple this possibly? I guarantee you, if you just give somebody the behavior change wheel, they will misapply it, they will have no idea what you're talking about, because it is extraordinarily complicated, even though it's still not as complicated as the full academic field. Yeah. And so I think striving for that, hey, I'm gonna start at the simplest possible place. I love asking the question, just tell me about a time you changed your own or someone else's behavior, right? And just getting them to reflect on the fact that actually they're doing this all the time anyway. Ah, man, I really wanted to get up earlier, and so I've been, doing these things and then doing these other things, and then just helping them use that example to start to say, oh, well, do you see how that's a promoting pressure? And do you see how that's removing and inhibiting pressure? And maybe you could try these other things, and just working through something that works for them in their life. And then using that to help them bridge into organization and these much larger issues. I think sometimes we have a tendency, to Michael's point, to start with like, the world's hardest problem. And you're like, well, maybe we could just talk about how I get up a little earlier in the morning and we'll work our way there.
Sounds good. Sounds good. All right, well, thank you so much for this. It was great to hear this discussion from people who have scaled this across so many places. The idea that we can start so small, but then absolutely tackle the greatest things. And we clearly have so much more work to do. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rocky. Thank you, Matt.